Okay, hello. Welcome to the W3C call for Wednesday, December 4th, 2019. Um, to begin with, just for the sake of the call, I think we all know each other, but if we could do a round of introductions, that would be fantastic. I'm Tim Hill, Data Standards and Technical Lead for the OpenActive project. Over to you, Nick.
Nick Evans, Technical Engagement on the OpenActive project. Also have a hat I wear, which is I'm in, but today I'm the ODI.
And David.
David, Trainers One. We produce an AI running coach, obviously very interested in route.
And last but not least, Tom.
Tom, co-founder of Played. We make search and booking tools, and we use lots of open data.
Okay, great. Thank you, guys. So the agenda today has got 2 points on it. One is safeguarding, which is a proposal we discussed, I believe, a month ago, 2 calls ago. And then the second is dealing with HTML in text descriptions, which I think is probably more important for the routes spec, but actually does have a role to play in the opportunity specification as well. So I'll just start sharing my screen here so we've all got access to it. Okay, so I'm going to hand this over mostly to Nick with regard to safeguarding, because Nick made a quite, I think, cogent and focused proposal a little while back. We discussed it at some length. And Nick, I think the general conclusion was that actually the technical mechanism was fairly simple, that we would need to consult with legal teams and other people like that about the exact form of the text that would be necessary to serve, but that there would be a basically quite simple mechanism for safeguarding, which would be to some extent a kind of self-certification process.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, without going through the detail from the previous call again, I suppose, I think where we are with this is that from a conceptual point of view, it seems like there's a mechanism that exists and it seems reasonable. I think everyone on the call last time said, yeah, it seemed reasonable. Chris Norfield made a couple of additions to it, which have been reflected in the proposal, although they were kind of a bit more nuanced. But yeah, I mean, from a kind of high level point of view, yeah, it seems to do the job. So there was questions about, how this works with NGBs and how it works with, and what safeguarding looks like in the sector now. I don't know if those questions really need to be answered in order for people to start using this and doing this, to be honest, because, I mean, this would work across lots of different types of schemes. That's the point. It doesn't have any kind of particular scheme encoded in it. So EMD, when they have their certification plan, having spoken to them about this in between the 2 calls, yeah, they're planning to be able to have instructors upload certificates to their portal, and true to form in the way that this is set up, that portal won't be part of the booking system. That'll be their own EMD portal, and they'll be publishing the data about those certificates and things that are being kind of self-certified against those instructors, but they won't be doing that. They'll be doing that connected to the instructor's ID or the organization ID, organizer ID, and that's separate to their booking system, which is Bookwhen, which is a separate system. So this fits very well with their plan, because there's a system they use for verification and there's a system they have for booking. Of course, those could be one system or there could be 2, and that's the point of this. So that was quite good, kind of verifies this. Also, MCR are doing the same thing. I know Lee couldn't make the call today, but they've got the same requirement. And again, the booking system's separate in some cases to the system where those certifications are being created. Obviously, the difference between MCR and EMD is that EMD is a self-cert program, whereas MCR is they've got some kind of people in there doing that. But again, the point of this is that it doesn't matter as long as the certification is described. It doesn't matter whether it's self-cert or not. I mean, there may be an argument that we want to put kind of self-certification in here as a I don't know, some Boolean or something, so people know if it's something that's that's been externally verified or not. But yeah, apart from that, I guess proposal now would be to just say, well, okay, we've got something. It's been verified by at least 2 organizations. Seems reasonable in terms of people who would actually be using it. Shall we crack on and kind of just put it into beta so people can start using it and see if and so therefore if Manchester adopt it and EMD adopt it in the first case, we'll learn from that how it's working, and kind of go from there, really.
Yeah, it certainly seems. Oh, sorry, Tom, was that something from you?
Yeah, I was just going to say it sounds reasonable and sensible, so I think it's best to just get moving on it from my perspective.
Yeah, and I suppose the best way of testing it out is just to get it going and try, and see how people find implementing it, subjected to review by legal teams and so on and so forth. But nothing is going to happen without actually getting it into the spec. So should that just be an action on me then to actually get that into the beta namespace?
Yeah, that sounds reasonable. And maybe we just put a little bit of documentation on this issue as to what's going on with beta and use it. I think there's examples of other issues where basically take the auto-generated table out of beta for the relevant fields and whack it into the issue so people can see what to do. And then that will also be the validator would then pick that up as well, as would the models for the various libraries. They pick that up from beta. So everyone will have full library support and validation support for this, which would be obviously helpful for implementers.
Right. Okay. So I'm just reviewing that. So that's beta namespace. And sorry, what was your proposal for the documentation?
Oh, just stick it in this issue. And the beta namespace actually has there's a column for GitHub issue, so you can link to the issue for each of them.
Right, okay.
And then this becomes the source of the documentation, and also obviously comments and feedback can go in there at the same time. So you get a couple of feeds going using this. The only thing actually that did come out of a conversation, I think it might have been with Lee, with somebody thinking about it, was the organizer JSON-LD embed thing, which actually isn't anything to do with the model. It's a kind of proposal for the mechanism of linking the organization, about whether that actually would be done the other way around instead, or by another, or whether we just don't be that prescriptive about it, which I think makes sense. Like, as long as you can get the ID somehow from one place to the other, maybe that's the more important thing. For example, in EMD, linking to the Bookwhen account from the EMD kind of account is a question. How do you do that? How do you kind of identify who you are in one system and another? One option is to do what this says and kind of just use the use the Bookwhen homepage, point to that, and then that has the information on it, and it kind of connects it, matches it. But there might be other options. For example, if you're using open data, you could use a search across all open data and say, find your own sessions in the open data, and then link to those. So you could verify on the basis of finding yourself in there, almost, rather than just specifically on a particular page. But I think that's probably something that will get worked out in the implementation detail, really.
Right. Yeah.
So as long as that, and that only exists so that you can create the feed, if you see what I mean. Like, once the feed is there, that, which is the main bit, this is standardizing and the bit people will be consuming, then that's kind of the more important bit. So how that JSON-LD embed works is kind of a bit more, maybe is a bit looser.
Right. Yeah, we can certainly leave it. Well, I guess the risk of leaving it a bit unspecified, that we then end up with putting the burden on data consumers, because we can't. Is it feasible to tighten the screws a bit after beta testing? Oh
no, I meant more. So from a data consumer's point of view, there will be IDs that match because it kind of has to for it to work. It's more from the implementer of the booking system and the certification system's point of view. They would need to think about how they connect their systems.
Right.
In a way that they can kind of, but I mean, realistically at the beginning, it's probably only going to be, we're talking about like 2 booking systems and 2 providers of certifications, and both will be using each other's. So that's quite a nice test in some ways. So they'll both be using each other's feeds. But yeah, I mean, why don't we leave it in there at the beginning and just see what comes out of implementation and see, and then maybe use that as a follow-up discussion.
Okay, and it sounds like, yeah, Tom was generally happy with that idea. And David, is this an issue that touches your concerns much?
No, not at this point.
Okay, so 3 votes in favor, 1 abstention. Okay, great. So with that said, shall we move on to the second topic, which is HTML. So right now, there's in fact only one mechanism for including text formatting in anything in OpenActive, and that is in a beta property called, I believe, formatted description, which is part of the opportunities spec. And then I believe in the proposal, there's a limited subset of HTML tags that are actually supported there. Nick, is my recollection correct as far as you're aware?
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I don't think the limited set of tags is being respected by implementers. I think the kind of reality of it is that formatted description beta property is where people shove their HTML. That's kind of how it works.
Right.
That HTML includes YouTube embeds, includes all sorts of stuff.
Right, okay.
So it's used for a number of things right now in that beta. But then, as you say, the formally allow formatted description, issue 136, that's kind of taking a little bit of a lead from what Google have done with Google Reserve in terms of having that subset of properties, and actually that's the list that's come from their proposal, and then that's agreed subset of properties is useful, because if you have that, it means that you can both sides, both the consumer and the publisher, can sanitize to an extent.
Yeah.
And I know actually Gladstone's implementation does publish using HTML with a subset of tags. I don't know if it's exactly this subset, but it certainly is a subset, and they do sanitize on any attributes within any tags that aren't href or like a couple others. You know, so if you try to use, I don't know, style equals, for example, or script, on-click events and things like that, it will just get stripped out. Because obviously the main issue this creates if you don't do sanitization well is cross-site scripting attacks. You could just plant a bunch of, JavaScript on everyone's sites. So that's clearly something we want to avoid by constraining that. And I think Google's taken the kind of very tight approach, rather than saying these are the things you need to do to sanitize your HTML, strip the script tags, strip the on-click events. Google said, actually, we're only going to support these specific tags and this combination, which is kind of a little bit like saying we're going to support Markdown. And the formatted description are one of the issues, or maybe it's further up this issue. Oh yeah, Markdown. We've had discussions before about whether people expose stuff in Markdown rather than HTML, because that might be a cleaner thing, because our Markdown's pretty much sanitized already, as long as you don't, well, you can still stick HTML in it, but assuming you don't process that stuff. The problem there is that most people don't have a Markdown processor in their whatever they're doing. It's almost always coming out as HTML, so that's just an additional step on both sides. To have people translate stuff into Markdown and then pull stuff out. But that said, I mean, maybe that's, that is a pain. But maybe if someone's already sticking all the HTML they have straight into this field, we're just asking them to put it through a Markdown processor. Maybe it's not the worst thing in some ways, because it's the same as putting it through any kind of sanitization, I suppose. If we come up with a standard sanitization, it might be easier to say our standard sanitization is Markdown. Done. from a spec point of view. And as long as you can get it through whatever Markdown processor you have, it saves trying to configure stuff with a custom set of tags and like this proposal is set up. So that kind of, I think that summarizes the discussion in there. So you've got proposal is option 1, Markdown, as it says in the pros and cons in that. It's inherently restricts the formatting, so it makes the spec easier to write. The problem is that you need to get a Markdown flavor agreed, because there's different Markdown flavors, and make sure that libraries are available across all languages, which I'm sure there are, but make sure that we're not excluding anyone. And then the restricted HTML tags, it's going to be supported more widely. It's going to be easier for people who already have HTML output. So mine and Pro, which is it's supported by Google Reserve, but to be honest, Google Reserve would need to do a bunch of mapping anyway to use this, so this wouldn't be a big blocker for them to convert it. And then, obviously, we need to define a strict subset of HTML and have a debate about what that looks like. So I think that all summarizes Markdown versus tags as an approach. And then it's probably fair to represent Lee's comment, which is, okay, there's 2 ways of doing this, and this is the reason it's been blocked until now. Is just this kind of discussion that that Lee's kind of raised there, and that we haven't really come to a conclusion on yet. Which is, there are a whole bunch to list out from 2017. His first response. There's a whole bunch of places you might want formatted description, meeting point, accessibility support, accessibility information, description, etc. Could all have formatted stuff. So what's our approach here? Are we going to duplicate all those tags with like formatted description, formatted attendee instructions, formatted meeting point, etc.? Or are we going to have some kind of generic mechanism we can apply that allows you to do formatting on any property, which it sounds like for roots is I guess becomes more relevant. So until roots, I think it's fair to say that everyone who has HTML content just has one field,
Right.
that stuff in. So formatted descriptions worked because you don't generally, either you have like a catch-all HTML field, which is your big description field, or you have lots of small fields, and those things are not formatted. And that's what fits with our spec currently. You don't tend to have like a lot of rich formatted fields, because the problem with lots of rich formatted fields is if you go to display them on a UI, it's a bit of a mess, because you've got to like put arbitrary headings against each one, and they're all rich text. So I think it is a bit of a mess if you think about trying to model something which has just got lots of rich text fields, and then how do you display all of that in a kind of consistent way? It does make sense that having just one rich text field forces people into, and it happens to be how people represent stuff anyway, but forces people to think about, I've got one description box for my catch-all, and I've got a bunch of other properties I use to describe stuff well, and use those both appropriately. But roots might be the counterexample for that. So it might be that you do want a bunch of free text boxes all over roots, and they all have rich text ability. And then I don't know how the user will see all of that in a meaningful way. But if you can't get away with just one description property in roots, then maybe that's a good reason to have a generic mechanism. Maybe it's a good reason we put the conversation off till now.
Yeah. So in summary, with existing opportunity data as we've got it published right now, everyone really just has the one description field. They're not trawling through a bunch of stuff and amalgamating it into that one formatted description. It's more or less,
yeah,
it's got more or less faithful to the original. Okay.
And bear in mind that formatted description itself as a property exists on multiple objects, right? On multiple types. So yeah, so there might be multiple descriptions, to be clear. There might be one for organization, there might be one for event, there might be one for, but there's generally not for a particular thing you're describing, this place or this event or this organization. There's not more than one formatted description for that thing. That makes sense.
Mm-hmm. Right, yeah. So yeah, complex model, but only one description per element. Yeah, roots is a separate case because you get, I think, much larger tracts of text. You'll get several paragraphs describing something, and then I think HTML becomes more or less necessary, at least for paragraph breaks. That if you end up with everything slammed into one giant paragraph, it becomes illegible and confusing, and you need to have some kind of formatting in order to preserve that. Um, and I,
So do you have examples of fields in Roots that would benefit from formatting?
yeah, I mean, the most obvious one is, again, description. It's just that description is sort of a more populated, more integral, and I think typically just longer um, kind of field than you find in other opportunities. But
But apart from description, right? So if the discussion here is, do we have a formatted description? So there's two. I kind of see there's two separate decisions here. Decision one is we have to decide whether it's formatted description and description are the two properties, and everything has that, Roots included, and there's no other place you can put the rich text.
Yeah.
That's A of the first decision. B of the first decision is anything that has plain text can take rich text, and we define a mechanism for that across all specs, and therefore obviously that might create more complexity for consumers because anything can become rich, but might be more flexible. And then the second decision is A is HTML and B is Markdown. That's what I see we have.
So, well, first of all, let's just review what's in the root spec actually for fields that are plausibly.
I think there's a fundamental difference between the description, as you've described, in that it's expected to be displayed on its own. It can have all sorts of interesting and rich stuff in it, versus other fields that may have multiple blocks of text, but they're designed to be held inside a larger structure. So whatever markup inside those other fields will be much more restrictive. And in many cases won't have any at all. So something as simple as recognizing a blank line double blank line means a new paragraph is unlikely to break any existing usage of those fields, but yet gets us out of here is just an unlimited verbose splurge of text.
Right.
That's good, yeah. So actually just recognizing the paragraph marks and rendering them appropriately as a recommendation for every bit of plain text. We don't even need to introduce bold or underline or anything at that point. We're just literally saying, make sure you've got paragraphs.
Yes, what might make sense is to recommend avoiding anything in there which might at some future point be taken as markdown, not committing to it, but that at some point we might find that there's a bunch of cases where we just want to have bulleted lists because of the type of text and whatever else. And if we've given some guidance to avoid stuff that looks like bulleted lists and Markdown might recommend it, effectively that could grow into a subset of Markdown, but it's not committed to at this point. Right now, it's just multiple paragraphs.
Yeah, that's really good. And I think the other use case to kind of really bear in mind here is actually Tim and I were there's a GitHub issue that's gone up from our discussion that we had last week about restrictions on bookings, and the restriction like you've got to be child under 12 must be accompanied, or 2-to-1 child to adult ratio, or so there could be a list of those. And what we've kind of proposed in that GitHub issue is it would be an array of text so that you've got effectively bullet points in each array kind of element of each string. This could be a bullet point. And the interesting thing there is if you're going to parse this for the purposes of rendering it on a page, then having Markdown and bullets makes sense. But if you're into the world of like, I'm going to read this out to someone, through a voice, or other kind of a medium, so it's not necessarily going to be rendered, to HTML, then at that point, all the other structure stuff makes much more sense. And anywhere that we've kind of veered into markup like things makes it much more difficult. So maybe it is quite good to, as you say, have just the paragraph marks, which means that really if you are rendering it to the screen, it will look good, but it also stops people from thinking, hey, maybe I'll stick some bullets in here because it supports a bit of Markdown. Maybe that's where, when we're modeling it, we can think about arrays of text and things so that those things can be read out clearly and displayed using whatever kind of style of user interface makes sense. I mean, it could be more than just bullet point options, I guess. And yeah.
I have a counterexample on that, possibly. If at some point you decide bullet points markdown is permitted, having it being able to drop in effectively on any place lets someone introduce that formatting structure literally in any piece of text, providing the consumers know that when they're parsing, because if you're parsing it as markdown, you can recognize the bullet points. So by definition, you've got the structure to be reading through, and then voice is reading, say, so here's a block of text, and then there's a list of 8 items now, and read them. So yes, having it in explicitly in the underlying structure makes that more explicit, but it then stops someone introducing it at any point in a way to help the layout or the structure of that particular sub-item.
So sorry, so I understand what's the difference between that and just having paragraphs, or is it more that if you just allow paragraphs, then you can upgrade more seamlessly to this?
If you allow paragraphs, you can upgrade more seamlessly to this. And if you say that there are cases where restrictions, so there's an explicit list in the underlying schema, that makes it obviously explicit for anyone consuming that data and presenting it. But it means you can only have those lists in places where the schema defines it. If you allow markdown in every single piece of text and the consumers know to parse it as markdown, since they have to be able to parse it as markdown anyway, when they're parsing any bit of text, they can go, well, here's a paragraph, and now here's a list of items. So a screen reader can use that data in order to present, here's a paragraph, and now I've got a list of items. And here's another paragraph, rather than only being able to have it in explicit points where the schema defines, here's a list of things.
So in that case, the proposal would be that you'd have something like, I don't know, a text format property at the top level saying markdown HTML plain text or something, and that's what would alert the parser to.
I'd say that the formatted description is always HTML because that's the catch-all and the easiest way for unsophisticated systems to just, here's something very rich. Every other piece of text is could implicitly become markdown, or a subset of markdown, such as paragraphs and bullet points and whatever else makes sense to screen readers and other ways of presenting that data, but not, we can now put in major headings and a bunch of other stuff that will impede general layout of listing a bunch of these individual blocks of text on a given page.
That's really interesting. Yeah, and how do we do this without making a breaking change? That's the other thing. So another example I thought about when you were saying that, David, the attendee instructions. Actually, at the moment, though it doesn't have any formatted ability, it's a potential place where you could feasibly want to put bullet points. You know, like I know that already EMD aren't using bullet points, but they're kind of ramming a bunch of equipment that you require into that with like commas and semicolons to separate them. So, you know, you might need to bring a bottle of water and a towel and whatever with you. And it'll just say comma, towel, comma, water, comma, and then and to make it into a sentence. But you could easily want bullet points in there. But then I suppose the next thing I'm thinking is, okay, so if we actually did that, let's say that one data publisher started to introduce those bullet points, you would break everyone's stuff. I mean, we can't, the thing is, because the way the spec works, and I guess the way schema generally works, is we can't force both sides to, without making a breaking change to the spec, which obviously we probably wouldn't. Well, that would be hard for people to kind of get their heads around, I think, if we forced to version 3. So to do it in such a way as it's a kind of improvement that can be kind of progressive enhancement style, like you can choose to include this formatting if you want to. I think it's going to be quite difficult to use the existing values, because otherwise you're going to be rendering, if someone's just taking a text straight out of that value and people start putting paragraph marks and stars in for bullet points, obviously their text is going to be rendered on the page with a bunch of stars and paragraphs. Well, no paragraphs, just a bunch of stars.
Markdown is as close as you can get to just progressively enhancement here, because the paragraph double blank will just get smashed down to a single piece of white space. Well, assuming you've got a full stop at the end of the first paragraph, you haven't lost anything to what people are doing now. And a list of items will end up with, here's dash item 1 dash item 2 dash item 3 dash item 4. So if you just paste, if you try and interpret, it's equivalent to pasting Markdown and into an HTML field. It'll just be one long piece of text, but we haven't really lost anything. Instead of semicolons separating the items, they'll have space dash space.
Yeah, that's true. I mean, you're right. The information is still there. It's just a little bit more kind of, yeah, space dash, as you say, space dash space doesn't necessarily look as to the user maybe as neat.
Mm.
But I see what you're saying from purely like a representation of information point of view. It still says water bottle. It still says towel. It just says it in a way that looks a bit weird.
Yes, it's not. Go ahead.
Yeah, I feel like there's a significant risk of sort of accidental markup interpretation, markdown interpretation. That, yeah, if you write, I don't know, doesn't quite work. But if you start writing water dash bottle, are you running the risk of suddenly segmenting things in a weird way?
The dash needs to start at the beginning of a line.
Right, but
so the markdown syntax is reasonably good at not being accidentally picked up. If you start allowing headings and everything else, then it's going to look weird. So that's more of a breaking change. But the paragraphs and the bullet points, those should be quite safe, because frankly, if someone's got something in there now that's got a bunch of lines that all begin with a dash and then a space and then some text, it's going to be weird anyway to the existing people.
right, yeah. So
now we're making it work for
right.
hopefully a growing subset of people.
Mm-hmm.
I see what you mean. In terms of breaking changes, it's not the worst if you have to kind of push formatting. But what I wonder then is, I mean, it's so just taking that train a little bit further. If we were to introduce a new type, that might be one way of doing this. So at the moment in our schema, we're using schema.org's types, text, date, things like that. If we introduced a new type, which was Markdown, and therefore any property in our schema that we gave, so it wouldn't just be every property, because if you took literally everything that could be typed text and allowed it to have Markdown, that would include all sorts of stuff, like all sorts of stuff that you definitely don't want to have, like address fields. You'd have the first line of the address could be, bullet pointed. You definitely don't want. So we probably don't want to allow a blanket rule, but it might be that introducing a type on a few of the fields that we know people might want to, like you say, progressively enhance, could be one way of doing it.
It feels like it's generally any field that's going to have paragraph-like data in.
Yeah, but then the question is, how does someone who's parsing this, like, come back to the same thing? Like,
I agree, tagging it's better. I'm not disagreeing. I'm not saying it should be implicit. I like the implicit. Sorry, I should have said.
You like the implicit?
I like the explicit. I like the idea of tagging them explicitly.
Yeah, that's it. I mean, because if you're in a situation where the thing that is inside the object that you're looking at could be a string, or it could be more than a string, and then you can switch your parser on and off basically based off of the thing in there. The problem we've got is that, as Lee's pointed out in the current proposal, if you do stick an object inside instead and say, for example, let's say that you've got attendee information, and attendee information inside can actually have like an object, which has got type, rich, formatted description or rich text, and then Markdown is another property, and then the content is another property. But the problem is, as Lee points out, that is a breaking change, because if anyone comes across that and they're expecting to see text in that field, they're going to be like, oh, that's not going to work. So they won't be able to even access the content at all. Whereas with the Markdown option, at least they can access the content, even though it looks a bit wacky.
Yes.
But then with that, you have the same. Then you can't know when to switch the parser on or off. You basically have to assume which may not be a problem, but you basically have to assume that it's Markdown that's in there. But that may be a problem though, because if you've got people that use asterisks in places, for example, currently, and then they have the Markdown parser switched on, you end up with stuff becoming italic and bold all over the place. You've probably seen that happen before with,
Yes, but there's whether or not this is Markdown or a subset of Markdown. Because the initial proposal was, well, we just want to have paragraphs, which got feature creep into, and bullet lists, they're actually really handy if we could have them. But there's a whole bunch of other stuff like Markdown can represent tables and a whole different category of headings, which you probably don't want. So do you say this is a subset of Markdown? And recommending that, well, it's interesting.
Yeah, I mean, it runs into exactly the same problem as defining an HTML subset, right? I mean, obviously we don't want links. So yeah, if we're going to support Markdown at all, we have to define some subset of it. And then it gets a bit hairy. And then you start getting into questions of what different Markdown flavors are happy to represent. I guess there is a common core, as Nick alluded to earlier. But I think it starts getting a bit tangled once you start introducing Markdown across the board.
Yeah, it's a really interesting one, isn't it? Like how to do this in a way that doesn't, like break everything as well. Yeah, well, but I think we could probably do this a little bit first principles, because let's say we've got 12 properties that all need to have rich text. The options are break the existing properties and then allow people to put something in them that's different and that won't be parsed by existing parsers, or create 12 new properties. I don't know what third way there is there, right? Because the property is so tightly defined right now to be a text string. And unless the third way is this Markdown approach, but in progressive enhancement. But if you do that, then as we just talked about, there's no easy, no standard way, at least, of showing. I mean, you could do something, nuts like prefix the text, prefix the text with the word formatted, : and then everything after that is interpreted as a Markdown, and therefore it will seamlessly work across both. But that seems a bit hacky.
I mean, I guess the third way is kind of by convention, and this is based purely on me just scrolling through the root spec. It is annoying because there are a lot of fields that are called description or something description, like risk description, transport description, and so on and so forth. Usually to disambiguate them from each other. So we've got, for instance, in risk advisories, there are risk descriptions and traffic descriptions. So we have this kind of plethora of description fields, all of which I think would need to support some kind of formatting for the sake of legibility. But of course, duplicating all of those with formatted traffic description, formatted risk description, formatted description does get quite clunky. So I suppose you could have some sort of general rule that anything called a description may be supporting Markdown there, or some kind of Markdown.
So that's good, but the thing with that is that, I mean, whether we do it using the implicit rule of based on the name, or whether we do it in the data model schema, in both cases, for backwards compatibility, doesn't it have the same challenge as the first two problems? Like, either we're going to break everyone's stuff and they won't be able to read the text at all if whatever they're doing at the moment, or exactly what we talked about before.
Yeah, true. It doesn't really evade it.
It does avoid the case where they can't recognize it at all. So the failure mode here is they're treating Markdown as plain text. That's the failure mode that we're concerned about. Everything else works because they still go to a field called description and read it, and it's full of text, and they still present something through to the user. We're just
Oh
concerned
no,
that the markdown markup is leaking.
no. I think it's actually. So if you're in the proposal, actually, Tim, on your screen, if you jump to the proposal and go to where it says restricted HTML tags, and then there's a little example of a snippet there.
Mhm.
I think this is the concern is this probably the snippet. So if you go up to restricted, keep going up, restricted HTML tag, there it is, that description block. So this is the kind of thing, where you've got a type and then you've got a format and then you've got content, which is explicitly saying this field is markdown and this is the markdown content. So I guess this is the question, like if we do this, we break all the things. If we introduce markdown, as you rightly say, David, the failure mode is that people render the markdown wrong. Yeah.
But that's quite a gentle failure mode in most cases, particularly if we, again, pick a subset of markdown and recommend that people represent more, but for now, this is all that's supported.
Well, I guess, yeah, I guess if you're thinking of version 2.1 of the spec, we introduce, paragraphs and bullet points. We introduced bold in version 2.2, by which point hopefully everyone's got a markdown parser in play, and they've done that so that they can support 2.1.
Yes.
And therefore it won't all blow up.
Yes, and we may find that 2.2 takes 3 years or it never happens, but if all we get is the paragraphs and the bullet points, that's really useful for a whole bunch of cases that are out there right now.
Yeah. And actually, from a style point of view, I used to work in journalism, and I know people can get tetchy around random bold and italic use if they've got a content guide. So, maybe actually having just the, bullet points that don't really allow people to go over the top with other formatting, which is going to look horrible if you're trying to create a subtle interface where you're using bold for your headings and then someone's gone and emboldened the entire of their description, it's going to completely blow up your plans.
Yes, though obviously the solutions to people, if you've got a markdown parser in your system presenting data and you're that tetchy about it, then you can filter the stuff that comes through before presenting it, but only if you know what to expect.
Yeah, right.
And at some point, you're going to have to introduce a markdown parser into your system in order to present the richer version of this. And then you get to filter it. But yeah, it is. Fortunately, Markdown doesn't provide a mechanism to change the font every third word like HTML does.
Yeah, right. Well, this sounds reasonable. So whether we do with by convention or by the schema, picking a bunch of fields, enabling a very small subset of Markdown, which is paragraph and bullet, maybe number as well. I don't know. Maybe that's unnecessary.
Yeah, but
and then
quite structural kind of markup, I guess. Yeah.
Right. Structural rather than formatting markup first, so that it doesn't have any negative consequences or limits them. Of the Google proposal, it would basically be you've got paragraph and list. You just wouldn't have division and bold and heading, which I think, to be honest, I don't know if we need division. If we say division and heading, it's probably a bit too much because of the issues we talked about with headings.
Yeah.
Then I guess, okay, so if we did all of this, what happens to formatted description, which is, I guess, a bigger case? So there's two cases, isn't there? This is like I need a little bit of structure in my existing fields case. But what about the case of I've got my colorful, well, not colorful, but there's a lot more formatting in the formatted description than maybe including headings, for example.
Sorry, I'm just gonna interrupt you there. We've got two minutes left on the call. I think this is quite a useful discussion, and I'm certainly happy to continue. I just want to verify that other people are happy to.
Oh, I've got a call at 3 actually.
Right. Okay.
Myself, but I mean, I'm not saying other people can't carry on. I guess it sounds like we've got a next step of this at least to take, in terms of there's a progressive approach that we could use schema or not, and it forces us to choose Markdown of the two options between Markdown and HTML because it's the only one that allows progressive enhancement.
So it kind of forces the other decision for us.
Well, it forces it for the everywhere, taking a whole bunch of fields and making them. For the single showcase description, formatted description, it still leaves that open because that's intended to be presented as the featured piece of information.
Mm-hmm. So are you thinking that that description field is an HTML field or is a Markdown field?
Formatted description, which is currently an HTML field.
Yeah.
It may retain that because we're specifically curtailing what can go in all the other fields. Even if everyone puts a Markdown parser, we're not going to allow, there'll be stuff that we're probably not going to allow in there that we may want in the formatted.
Mm. Mm.
And also, if we go, sorry, go ahead.
So I was just going to say, so is this scoped purely to roots, really? Because formatted description and description are a pair in the opportunities spec that are doing that job. So are we really only talking about roots now, or is this something they should be more broadly applied?
It feels like it's something that could be more broadly applied to everywhere that we've got a description to allow the Markdown. Whether or not it's trialed somewhere just in roots, and then if it works well, yes, let's extend it elsewhere.
But aren't we, maybe I'm oversimplifying here, but wouldn't it be just the case that we've got everything that the schema says or that by convention says? I think I'm favoring a schema actually because it's a bit more explicit and it doesn't limit our naming options across other things. But whichever we choose, that is where the Markdown lives, of our subset of Markdown, and then the formatted description field, as it is kind of in beta, lives on using HTML or Markdown, but a full set of options available for a very specific purpose of the catch-all bucket of stuff. And that could be applied to root stuff too. So you could use formatted description on a segment or on the root guide itself. And then, but those two actually solve everything across all specs. So every object has one catch-all bucket, which is well formatted and can be, if you've got a page that you're rendering this on, that's probably the thing that goes in the middle of the page, right? Because it's unknown. It's just this massive blob of stuff which needs headings and bold and all sorts. And then you've got the other stuff we talked about structurally to cover the other bits. I'm going to need to go. Just being summoned.
Okay.
But yeah, I'll leave you guys to go.
See you later, Nick.
It sounds like you got a pretty clear proposal going forward, as just summarized. So we keep formatted description as the HTML treasure trove, except for things that create clear security concerns. And then we define a type, which is basically a very, very restricted structural markup for Markdown, and use that on a much wider array of fields. And then we're done.
Well, I think there was the open question if an unrestricted version of Markdown can provide all of the rich formatting we currently want out of formatted description, could it be Markdown everywhere, just unrestricted in the formatted description and restricted elsewhere?
Right.
However, that's likely to be a breaking change for a whole bunch of people who've got HTML and formatted description elsewhere, if we're looking for a general pattern. But if we start with restricted Markdown in all of the other fields, see how that goes, and potentially in a later revision introduce more Markdown, over time the formatted description might become irrelevant because the description, which is a Markdown field, will have all of the semantic layout that's required in order for people to put it in their page.
Right, yeah, so indeed progressively enhancing as we discussed. Okay, I mean that sounds like a gentle, indeed, gentle path in that does, I think, almost everything we wanted to do. I guess the next thing that is incumbent is to add that to the issue. David, can I assign that to you? Are you happy to write that up?
Yes, as long as someone's happy to come and whack me about the head if I get it wrong.
Yeah, or more likely do a thumbs up. You know, or both possibly. Okay, fantastic. And then with the safeguarding, yeah, I think it's about just moving that into beta and getting the models updated so that we can actually support that in our tooling and just seeing how we go from there.
Yeah, that sounds like a good plan. Thanks for moving that forward.
Okay.
I just wanted to add, it's a random topic, but I wanted to see how to get it kind of pushed through, is that we're effectively creating an activity finder for walking sports. I noticed on the activity list that there is no activity for, say, walking tennis or walking netball. There is for football, but there isn't for a few of the other sports that are actually becoming quite popular. So I wanted to kind of submit a few requests for the activity list if we could include them. And what's the best process to do that at the moment?
Did you receive the newsletter on Monday?
I did, but I didn't see anything relating to this.
Oh, okay, there actually is a link. We actually got like a Google form basically for suggesting additions to the list.
Oh, okay, great.
Well, I'll just send a link to that to you immediately after this call, just so you've got that.
Awesome, that'd be useful. It would just make life a lot easier for us if we could do that.
Okay, cool. I'll send it to you.
Perfect. All right, thanks a lot, guys.
Thanks very much, guys.
Cheers.
Okay. Thanks.
Talk to you both soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.